Welcome back to the Underground Strategy Podcast. My name is Max, and today we have Andrew Chatterton with us again. Last time he was on, we talked about the hardcore auxiliary units and how some Brits might have had to kill their neighbors if it all kicked off. But this time, we're looking at the bigger picture and what other systems that actually were in place to stop or at least slow down a German invasion. That's also something Andy covers in his new book, Fortress Britain 1940, where you will find defenses most people haven't even heard about. So, Andy, to kick things off, what was the state of Britain's physical defenses in the mid-40s, and how imminent was the German invasion?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because looking back, you can see, particularly in the summer of 1940, and using hindsight, that the invasion was never very likely. But taking it from, and we might have talked about this last time, taking it from Britain's perspective, they've just seen Germany take over Western Europe, essentially. They've beaten France in 6 weeks, which is not only a huge country, but a huge army, an incredibly mechanized army. And they've been smashed in 6 weeks. And they looked utterly unstoppable. So, even though we've got the channel, looking from Dover and seeing the coastline with the enemy army just the other side, they're visible. At that point, invasion looks imminent. And even to the extent of, whether Hitler wanted to go ahead with Operation Sea Lion or not, they were gathering these river barges in huge numbers in the harbours of Europe. So, yeah, with hindsight, obviously, not very, it's never going to happen. But I think, we use hindsight too much. And I think from perspective of May, June, July, August into later 1940, it was, well, not only entirely possible, but actually very likely, just because they'd had so much success and looked an unstoppable machine, so far that year.
And just building on that, Andy, firstly, let me start with just welcome back. Great to have you back.
Pleasure.
I think that's fair. We have that advantage sitting comfortably in our sitting room in our study saying, yeah, sure, it was never going to happen. But in the moment, it was pretty tricky because there were lots of people saying, yeah, let's make peace, appeasement, all kinds of stuff like that. And along comes Churchill. We know the history. And really your book, which is really well written, by the way, it starts right there and it gives the sense of urgency and a little bit of kind of air quotes, Britain alone. We know maybe it wasn't exactly alone, but let's roll with it. Was it the case? And how did that translate, into that kind of defensive infrastructure that was built given all this hype and fear at the time?
Well, I think we weren't alone because we had a huge empire. Britain itself was massive, right? But so we weren't alone, but we were alone in the sense that we were the only country in Europe essentially still fighting on. And after Dunkirk and after the evacuation of British forces from France, Britain had a massive problem because we'd left almost all of our mobility, all of our vehicles, all of our tanks on the beaches of France. We couldn't get them back. So in terms of defending the country, that is a massive problem because suddenly you haven't got the option of just having mobility across all, just behind the lines across your whole coastline. You have to be able to use them strategically and a lot more efficiently. So Ironside was CNC Home Forces. He was brought in and he had immediately a real issue. How do we defend against a German invasion from sea, number one, and two, from, we'd seen the effectiveness of airborne troops. Belgium in France, the effectiveness of airborne troops coming in and dropping behind the lines and causing chaos and then linking up with the land forces. So Ironside had a massive problem and he had to move quickly and he didn't have a huge amount of resources. And so what he did do is quickly come up with a strategy that was then criticised widely at the time and ever since. But I feel like he didn't have a choice. So his overall strategy was to build these stop lines, to build these pillboxes that we still see scattered across the British countryside in a way to force the Germans in a direction that the British wanted them to go. It's a way of ensuring that the Germans are forced in a certain direction. So then you're able to use your limited mobility to then attack them in a place where you'll know they're going to be, because otherwise you're going to have to disperse your tanks and other vehicles so thinly, they're not going to be effective at all. So they tended to be in the center of the country or just below London, in the center of the country. So then once the Germans were pushed in that direction, they could come down and effectively counterattack them. So that's just a kind of the overall general strategy at that point in 1940. But so, for example, in terms of how quickly this was done, the Taunton stop line, which runs from the Bristol kind of area in the West Country and then runs right down from coast to coast, from North Devon coast to the South Devon coast, where it comes out of Axmouth. That entire stop line was built in 6 weeks. So that's hundreds of pillboxes. That's all these, which we'll talk about later, all these anti-tank traps, all these dragon's teeth, things that would just slow the Germans down, force them in the direction and allow us to counterattack more effectively. That was done in 6 weeks. So huge amounts of effort, huge amounts of concrete were put into action really, really quickly in an attempt to try and negate the fact that we didn't have any mobility, or not much mobility in terms of tanks and other vehicles to try and counter the German invasion.
I mean, that's almost Chinese level efficiency. It's kind of wild building stop lines that fast. And it feels like it was this kind of mix of a bit of official planning, but mostly rapid improvisation. I think I only know about one of them. The GHQ line, I think, if that was one of them. And just to recap, those were basically linear defense zones, right?
Yep.
With pillboxes, dragon's teeth, and I guess coastal stuff as well.
Yeah. So, for example, I live in a town in Devon, just an ordinary town on the sea. If I stand on the seafront, I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, just on the beach, 7 different varieties of Second World War beach defences still in place with us. And obviously the beaches themselves would have been covered in scaffolding, mined and everything like that, which were taken away. But even now, and I'd say everyone in Britain has definitely seen a pillbox of some type. And often pillboxes, I think, seen in the modern day context, confirm our narrative of what we think Britain was like in 1940 particularly. Half-assed, a bit crap generally, and not going to be effective. It just looks like they've just, they look utterly rubbish. But if you saw them in a wartime context, you'd see an entirely different thing. And I think that's the important point, is that seen in the context of the time, you would have seen not a pillbox in an empty field, but actually slit trenches all around it. It would have been camouflaged. It would have been connected to other pillboxes. It would have been connected to gun emplacements. It would have been manned by regular, highly trained soldiers. Too often, particularly in Britain, we just think the soldiers defending Britain had the Home Guard, Dad's army, so old blokes with pitchforks inside pillboxes. Yeah, if that was the case, it would have been crap. And we would have been destroyed. That just isn't the case. So I think, a lot of our perception comes from, things like Dad's army, but also the fact that we still see these Second World War emplacements in our everyday lives, and they look rubbish. But because you're not seeing it in a wartime context, you can't really understand how effective they would have been, or the place that they had in the wider strategy. You have to see all this stuff within context. So, the pillbox is there because it's next to a river. Therefore, you're forcing the Germans west or east or whatever direction it is, and therefore you can use mobility creep. So, yeah, it's all about seeing it in wartime context. And I think pillboxes are the most amazing thing. There are lots of pillbox experts out there who would be able to explain in granular detail about what each different type of pillbox has and, why they were built that way, and things like that. But just seeing them even now, just going in them, you can see how brave the guys were who would have been in them and, taking on an invasion. They're the most remarkable structures.
I'm sorry to cut in there. I don't normally do that, Annie, but just on our last chat, you actually inspired us to take a deeper look into this whole defensive element. And so what we've done, we've spoken to some people, but more on the Scottish side. And maybe one day you'll be joining us for, some whiskey up here, as part of your research, And so we've recently been to Aberdeen.
Yeah.
At a place called Black Dog Beach, which sounds like it could be a really good IPA, but actually is a place that looks like, one of the beaches during D-Day. And there we saw a couple of, and, I'm telling you, you started it and we've now taken this a little bit, just on our own kind of improv UGS way. And it just speaks to all that you've said, or seeing it in person and the physical structures, just exactly as you said it. It can seem as a little bit shoddy. And just to your last point, I mean, I couldn't imagine, manning that particular structure while cannon fire is coming in. But do you think it would have gone down like that? Or do you think that people would have maybe gone to a trench line behind and, then maybe deployed a little bit differently in action, I mean?
Yeah, so I think the pillboxes are there. There's no expectation they're going to be there for any length of time, or that the pillboxes themselves are going to throw the Germans back in the sea. As I said earlier, there's going to be slit trenches all around them. The guys are going to be coming out the pillboxes, using the slit trenches, almost using the pillbox as a distraction. But their role really, especially those on the beach, is really to cause as many casualties as possible and to slow up the advance off the beaches. So they haven't got a straight line out. They're having to fight hard to get off the beaches. That then gives us time to communicate the fact that the invasion is happening in these areas, and then more effectively use our counterattacks. And then, as they go further inland, they'll find more and more layers of defense as they go on. So that, they'll be attacked by more regular troops. They'll have to navigate the stop lines and the other pillboxes. There'd be attacks by the home guards in towns and villages. And, the airborne troops will be attacked by home guard as well. That was their kind of initial role, really, was the thought that, we haven't got enough troops to have troops in every single town and village. Therefore, we're going to have to find something to counter the threat of the airborne troops. And then all the stuff of the auxiliary units and the special duties branch that they're attacking them from behind. And once you see it in that kind of wider context, a crappy pillbox on its own in a field suddenly makes a lot more sense, because it's part of this wider strategy. And I think that's the key to understanding Britain's defence, particularly in 1940.
Time for a tactical reload. If you're enjoying this, leave a review on your platform. YouTube crew, hit subscribe to support the mission. Let's roll. And it feels like they must have had some kind of effect on their morale too. Just seeing something physical being built. Even as a civilian, that kind of visible defense gives you something to hold on to. It's not just troops moving around and news reports and stuff that you actually never see. This is something real, something solid. I mean, it's concrete right there in front of you that you can actually touch. I don't have that much experience fighting from defensive structures or within a framework of defensive structures. But even from the soldier's perspective, having a trench line or a bunker, even if it's not that effective, it still gives you a sense of protection. It feels like something has your back.
I think you're absolutely right there. Absolutely right. And I think, for the general population who had just seen, German victory after German victory, to then see actually we are putting huge amounts of effort in very quickly. As you say, it doesn't matter, particularly how effective you thought they might, but something's happening. We're galvanizing. We're getting ready for this potential invasion. And, even the Home Guard, even the LDV as they started off as, were, thought of, this is a bit rubbish. But actually, there was a moment later in 1940 where the code word Cromwell was given out by Brooke, who'd taken over from Ironside. And that's basically just to warn, particularly the units in southeast of England, that all the conditions for an invasion were right. Tides were right, the moon was right, the weather was correct. They'd seen an increase in the number of barges being brought into channel ports. And so they sent out this word. And most of the units in regular and Home Guard units in the southeast kind of understood that this was just basically get on your toes, get ready. This, if it's going to happen, these are the right conditions for it to happen. Elsewhere in the country, there wasn't such a great understanding about this. And Home Guard were like, right, it's happening. This is the actual event. Cromwell means it's actually happening. So they all got going. Some auxiliary units went to their bunkers. The effect it had, even though, it was a massive false alarm, it had two things. One, Brooke had to rethink and get clarity on what each of these code words meant and get them out to the country quickly. But secondly, there's loads of reports in local newspapers about local populations being reassured and impressed by the way, particularly the Home Guard, were able to come out, get ready, and prepare to defend their town and village. It gave them a sense of reassurance that actually these guys, aren't, a bunch of amateurs and a bit crap, but actually could be an effective work. So lots of this kind of stuff, I think, would have reassured the local population, and to an extent, some of it might well have been built for those reasons. It's like the AK guns in in London, I mean, generally pretty ineffectual, but hearing something fight back against the Blitz was reassuring to the general population. So I think a lot of this stuff was almost, PR, but, would have been effective in some way or another.
And when you mention PR, I'm thinking if Europe's going to spend, 9,000 billion on defense now, I want to see more pillboxes, I want to see serious pillbox construction happening.
Exactly. I don't know how effective pillboxes would be against a drone attack, because they could probably just fit them through the slit, you see. So they might not be great these days, but I don't. Auxiliary unit operational bases would still be effective. I'd still recommend that.
I definitely second that recommendation of secret auxiliary unit bases. And I actually hope that there are some out there, just prepping. And otherwise, I'm going to start building one in my backyard. So, in 50 years, people can fall through the roof and have amazing fantasies about what happened there or what didn't happen there. But I also wanted to ask, because we've been talking about physical defenses like stop lines, pillboxes, and all of that, but that's not the whole story, right? We also have the air side and the naval side. You got radar, decoy airfields, fake villages, naval boom defenses. So there's quite a lot of serious infrastructure backing up the defense of Britain at this point.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And, I think from the air perspective, understandably, the whole focus is always on Spitfires and Hurricanes and fighter command. But in the book, I wanted to focus on the other aspects of air that basically get whitewashed by Spitfires. And radar's a massive, massive part of that. During the First World War, Britain was bombed by Gotha bombers and Zeppelins and things like that. And our air defense was basically slinging up planes in the hope that we could find them somewhere and get some shots at them before we needed to come down and refuel. Not a very effective way of air defense. And then a few years later, when air power is almost everything, you have to find ways to more effectively counter, a bombing raid. And radar absolutely did this. It was critical during the late 30s. And I'm sure part of Chamberlain's appeasement strategy was to give us more time to get this type of technology in place and working. So from radar's perspective, there was chain low and chain high. So chain high saw the planes coming in at certain altitude. Chain low kind of managed those that were kind of going across the wave tops. You had both heights covered. And then as they came over land, you had the observer corps on the coastal crush. So guys who were trained in observing numbers and direction and, what types of bombers they were and, where they were likely heading. All this information was then sent in, collated, and then you could send up fighter groups to where you've been intelligently, the information you've got allows you to make informed decisions about where your fighter command should go or where your fighter group should go up and attack the bombers, because generally which direction they're going and how many there are, which means you can attack them almost immediately, which means you don't waste fuel. And it's a much more effective way of fighting evade. And you could see, obviously the numbers were massively inflated during the war in terms of how many we shot out the sky, but we were hugely effective. And, in my opinion, just don't think we were ever going to lose the air battle. There was definitely, it was definitely close at points, but we were so effective in terms of radar and being able to pinpoint where they were coming and how to attack them. Our tactics were generally very good. The other advantage, of course, is that we had home advantage, right? So if a pilot shot down and is able to get out of his plane, we can just get him another plane and he can fly off again. If a German shot down and bails out, he's then prisoner of war and the Germans have lost another pilot. So, we had big advantage in terms of home, but all the technology we had in place, the strategy we had in place was hugely effective. So in terms of the Battle of Britain, yes, absolutely, Spitfires and Hurricanes did, a lot of the work, but we absolutely cannot forget what allowed them to be so effective. And I think that's, that's another part of the Britain in 1940 that people kind of just overlook and forget about. And the other aspects of air that I looked about in the book is that Bomber Command. So Bomber Command obviously did huge amounts of work later in the war in terms of bombing strategic targets and cities in mainland Europe. But actually, even at this point in 1940, when they had really crap bombers, they were doing really brave work over Europe. They were still bombing strategic targets in Europe, but not in such great numbers, obviously, but also were bombing the barges, for example, in the European harbours, because if you take all the barges out, that means they have to send more before they can invade. So they were doing huge amounts of work over there. Coastal Command were flying equally as bad planes and taking on U-boats and protecting convoys, and they would have been critical if the Germans would be coming over to hit the invasion barge and things like that. So I think in Britain particularly, we think that our air defences were entirely made up of just Spitfires and Hurricanes, but actually, there's loads of different aspects we need to take into account. And then we've got the Navy, and Britain's Navy at this point is the largest and most powerful Navy in the world. And, the home fleet, it's in terms of numbers, is absolutely ginormous. I mean, and, we are an island, so our naval power is absolutely fundamental to the defence of this island. And it gets basically no look in the discussions around how Britain would have defended itself. For example, the Germans took, I think, about 23 vessels of varying types up during the Norwegian campaign in early summer 1940. So, about 23. The Royal Navy destroyed or damaged 18 of them. Number one, that means Germany's ability to invade is cut down very quickly. And number two, it shows you the power of the Royal Navy, that they absolutely could take on the German Kriegsmarine. So almost forgotten about. It was absolutely fascinating reading about these aspects, because then you start to think there's absolutely no chance the Germans could have got across, just the sheer power of the Royal Navy. So really interesting, really interesting.
I think that's a key point that you mentioned about the United Kingdom historically being, and I'm going to get some of the military theorists riled up, but being a sea power, right? As opposed to the Americans, God love them, but they'll use the Navy to take a force to land to fight, as opposed to, a sea power in the traditional sense, sea routes, projection, etc. And I think that's a key point that you mentioned, and something that's pretty important. And I think, the threat of U-boats and submarines, etc., was perhaps maybe even bigger, compared to the air threat, and how that all played out. I'm just trying to bring that into context with so much focus on, the Battle of Britain, which ties in almost with a little bit of myth making.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. And the Navy played, I talk a lot, particularly around the auxiliary units, about the sheer brutality and ruthlessness of Britain at this point. So again, something that that isn't usually associated with Britain. The Navy went to Mers El Kabir in North Africa to destroy the French fleet that was there, because if there's two capital ships there, Dunkirk and Strasbourg, if they'd fallen into German hands, or if that fleet had fallen into German hands, then, the prospect of invasion increases, even further. And I think it was about 1,200 French sailors died in the Royal Navy's attack against the fleet that was just weeks before our allies. And it's utterly brutal. And the Navy was sick about. Churchill was absolutely devastated that the French kind of forced our hand in terms of having to destroy this. Part of the French agreement with us at the beginning of the war was if there was a surrender, then it had to be agreed by both parties, and that the French fleet would sail to British ports wherever they were in the world. So could go to Empire ports as well, but they didn't, and they went to North Africa, and especially after Vichy came in, suddenly whose navy is this? And it's utterly brutal what they had to do. It was awful that, these guys who were just your allies just a few weeks before, you were now absolutely obliterating.
Totally. And I mean, that's, I don't want to say harsh. It's just, I was just recently doing some work on this very difficult topic. I mean, what would I know anyway, but how leaders have to make these almost impossible decisions in crises and in war in particular.
Yeah.
And just the ones that you mentioned, it's pretty brutal. Or people hold out at all costs, and they are all going to die. And we see, during the same conflict in the Second World War, there are examples of this terrible decisions. I want to tie on to one of your earlier points also. There's so much to unpack in what you said there, Andy, because the story about the Air Force is an interesting one. And I'll never be far away from peddling my own work, because the Air Force was formed by, and I wrote a little bit about it, me and Ian van der Wacht, that Jan Smuts, in the First World War was there. And of course, it's attributed to him, but how these things go. Everyone's talking about it. He happens to pull the thing together and some insights. I'm probably going to get some flack for saying that, but hey ho. But there's a development of the Royal Air Force, right? So we take it for granted that this standalone military service is in place, but there was a development for maybe 30 years, etc. I love all those technological parts that you spoke about, and maybe I just haven't found the perfect book on that yet. Like I found pieces, like it was the importance of radar. I mean, like the net, it was this net that it was all over Britain, and it was brilliant.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the other elements that allowed this, the technological elements. Maybe there is a book out there, someone will write to us and tell us, or maybe you know, Andy, but I don't think I've seen the history told. I've seen pieces, Enigma and this and that, Turing and parts of the radar and parts of different, of innovations, but that complete tech, maybe it's still to come,
Yeah.
Maybe to come in an accessible way,
Yeah, I think that's the key, is accessible. Yeah, and you're right. It was, without it, I still think we probably would have won, but it would have been a much, much closer thing, because just slinging up planes in the hope that you find the invading fighters or bombers coming over is not an efficient way of using your aircraft. So it was absolutely critical. And even when Germany were targeting, when they were hitting the airfields, they were also hitting the radar stations. And when I think one in the Isle of Wight got taken out for a few days, and it was remarkable. It was only a few days because they managed to get it up and running, but that did give us a black spot, and suddenly that was scary, because we couldn't, if they're coming in that direction, we didn't know who was coming in, what numbers, and it's having that knowledge, being pre-armed with that knowledge before they were even in your airspace is a huge advantage, a massive advantage.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, having that radar capability, it's definitely a game changer, and you basically see the cards that are being dealt at the table as you're playing, which is great. Tony mentioned Turing also when it came to technical developments, and I also think that as radar gets brushed over, I think Turing has been brushed over quite a lot. He was basically shamed for years, even if he cracked Enigma code and did legendary stuff for the war effort. And he only got official recognition for his work quite recently, right?
Oh yeah, only in the last few years. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's easy to forget both people and equipment that were kind of on the sidelines sometimes in these large conflicts, but they really made a dent. But if we zoom out for a second, since we have been talking a lot about British defenses here today, how do they compare to what the Allies faced on D-Day? I mean, how strong were the Nazi defenses, the Atlantic Wall and all that? And are there any parallels we can draw between them?
Yeah, I think we can. I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because Rommel came in and relatively late and made huge improvements to the Atlantic Wall in terms of its defensive capability. The trouble with every aspect of German military strategy is that you've got Hitler sitting behind it. And sometimes I think we forget that he's mental, so he's not making strategic decisions. I'm not comparing to any modern day leader, but the ability to think strategically about these things rather than just making it up on the hoof is absolutely key. And of course, the other thing is that Hitler was doing is that he was playing off his generals against each other. So whilst one wanted, tanks near the beaches, to attack it the invasion as soon as it came, Rommel wanted them further back to be more of a mobile defense. Hitler chose neither and a bit of both, and so to effectively defend the beaches suddenly became a lot harder. But where there are, you can go to France now, and where there are the pillboxes and the beaches would have been full of scaffolding and mined and barbed wire, you can see how effective they were. Omaha Beach is a good example. I mean, it's obviously slightly complicated, but those troops were pinned down for a large amount of times by minimal amounts of troops operating out of pillboxes and in slit trenches, and that massively delayed the push off the beach. So you can see how effective it could have been had it been the other way around. The other thing is that the Atlantic Wall was being built urgently, but by a lot of slave labourers, and with slave labourers, you're not going to get the best work. I mean, that's just the nature of using slaves, isn't it? They're not going to be giving their all into putting the concrete in the right places, or whatever. So German defences were a lot of disadvantages for a number of reasons. But where Allied troops came up against pillboxes and good beach defences, you could see that they were struggling to get off beaches. And I think that's the point from a British perspective, is that, and again, that point I was saying, that these things aren't meant to be pushing the troops back out to sea. This is an initial engagement to cause as many casualties as possible and to slow down that advance inland. And it would have been very similar scenes on the beaches of Britain for sure.
tuned in, you're liking the vibe, so why not buy us a beer? Think of it as hydration for strategy. Head to undergroundstrategy.com/support and keep us in the fight. All right, back to business.
Yeah, it does excite the imagination. I was just mentioning earlier some of the beaches we saw in the north of Scotland, and there are similarities. And one just thinks, I could never actually imagine, but just the carnage of it. As you said, we know it's going to be like a fight, right? There's going to be two forces just colliding there, and by force of will and all of that, you're going to get a little bit ahead. It does make one think what those, this question is neither here nor there or this comment, but, just the sacrifice of those people that went over, right? I mean, God, it must have been one hell of a thing.
Yeah, absolutely awful. Well, everyone always focuses on Omaha, but even on the other beaches, I mean, there were mass casualties on the other beaches. One of my relatives got killed. He was in the Essex Yeomanry, and he got killed he was off the beaches, but he got killed by mortars in a cornfield. And, it's just huge casualties. And I think he came on Sword Beach, which is a British beach, but Sword Beach, you don't really talk about the casualties at all. It's almost as they kind of strolled off the boat and through, but it wasn't. Yeah, it was brutal everywhere. Of course it was.
Yeah, it's kind of weird how it is with Normandy landings that it's always Omaha Beach and you never hear about Sword Beach. I mean, if you do that, you're a bit of a nerd. But yeah, it was intense stuff, and I think personally I would rather land on Black Dog Beach up in Aberdeen, as it seems to be slightly quieter in terms of carnage and all that.
Yeah, and Scottish beaches are interesting, aren't they? If you're thinking about the main threat from France, you're thinking, well, why have they got defensive beaches up there? But there was always the possibility that a secondary invasion or an initial invasion would have happened from Norway, from occupied Scandinavia. So, and again, people don't really think about why there was such huge defences in Britain. There were auxiliary units based in Orkney. I mean, that seems absolutely mental, doesn't it? But the threat from Norway was thought to be such that those forces had to be up there as well.
Totally. And just before we move off that point, I think some of the training and simulations for D-Day, because of the similarities in terrain, was done up in some of those beaches in Scotland. It makes one think, and I suppose, now it's a bit of a stretch, but those defenses had a double purpose then, for training.
Yeah, absolutely.
Myself, I haven't seen the Scottish beaches yet, because unfortunately I couldn't make it when Tony and Alessandro were up in Aberdeen. I would have liked to, of course, but I decided to wait until there's more whiskey on the table. Then I will go. Definitely. But how much of this defensive network actually survived? There is still quite a lot of leftovers out there, right? Leftovers might be a bit of a strong word, but let's say memories from that time. Are there any particular places that you would recommend if someone wants to go out and physically walk through what is left of Fortress Britain?
Good question. There are a huge amount of defensive structures still in place across and throughout Britain. As I said, just where I am on this little town, there are at least 7, I'd say. Yeah, there's 1, 2, 3. There's 4 pillboxes, 2 machine gun emplacements, a gun emplacement, still all in place here. And the same is on the same as the next town on, and the other way. There's still huge amounts. So in almost every coastal town that you go to, I think you will be able to find, if you look, a Second World War defensive structure still in place. I know the ones in Norfolk, for example, that are still loads of those, kind of the associated Dragon's Teeth and anti-tank stuff as well, that are always worth a watch. But I honestly think if you go to, without depressing your family, if you go to a coastal town on holiday, you will be able to find a pillbox or some anti-tank Dragon's Teeth or some structure of some kind or another. It's all around us, and because it is all around us, it tends to get ignored and not understood at all, because you're just seeing basically what looks like a brick shed on the coast, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think if listeners are next time it doesn't even have to be on the coast, they're everywhere. If there's a key town, there's some great examples where they've got a brilliantly disguised pillbox. I think it's like a little cottage, but pillboxes are disguised as well. So, it might be disguised as a shop or I've seen one that's disguised as a petrol station. So some really ingenious designs, and they're literally everywhere. Every town, village you go through, you'll be able to find some kind of defensive structure in some form or another. And if you fall down a hole, then you probably found an auxiliary unit bunker. So,
I mean, that's the dream, right? Falling down a hole in the British countryside and just hoping it's not a creepy dungeon, but an auxiliary unit bunker. I love that. I just love that. And I'm happy to hear that you are not as home blind as I am, because you actually know your stuff, and that was great recommendations. If somebody would ask me, like, Max, what would you do for a weekend in Stockholm? I would just go totally blank. But, I've only lived there for 25 years, so what can you expect? You're not going to get more than that out of me. So that is what it is.
Exactly right.
I completely agree with that. Just how that kind of defenses just becomes part of the architecture now and the landscape. But when you were doing the research for your book, Fortress Britain, was there anything that you found that really surprised you, or anything that any last words you want to give to our listeners? And we'll add it into the show notes, of course.
What really surprised me? I think I was surprised at the amount of criticism that Ironside got for putting in pillboxes and stop lines. And even Alan Brooke, who took over from him, was pretty damning about this strategy. But you have to bear in mind, by the time Brooke got in place as CNC Home Forces later in the summer of 1940, the mobility potential of Britain's defences had changed dramatically, because we'd pumped out tanks left, right and centre out of factories throughout Britain. And so Brooke's ability to be more mobile in his defence, which is absolutely the right strategy if you've got the mobility to be able to do it. So he was able to more or less do away with pillboxes and stuff like that, because he then had not huge amounts, but much greater numbers in terms of tanks to be more effective in mobile defence. Ironside, in the few months that he was CNC, basically didn't have a choice, and I find it really surprising that not more people have defended him. I felt really sorry for the guy, so I think that was my great surprise. But also the amount of stuff that just isn't recognised, particularly in Britain, about Britain's overall defensive efforts and how much it has been whitewashed by Spitfires and Hurricanes and Dad's army.
Sure. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just going to say, because we always support the underdog, and maybe Ironside is due a revisionist, biography.
I think so. I felt really sorry for him. Really sorry for him.
Because, and to be fair, I mean, I think it's, because I've read some pieces in your book too, but it's just like the whole kind of maneuver versus static warfare got kind of like dumped on him. Like,
yeah, 100%.
But then with the D-Day, there were defenses because, there's certain continuities in war. A trench will be a trench. You'll want some sort of bunker, and it just is what it is, right?
Yeah, correct. Exactly right.
Well, on that note, a big thank you, Andy. We have Andy Chatterton. He's a friend of the podcast. We'll put everything in the show notes, and please do get his book from all good bookstores as well as online good.
Yeah, let's go. I thought you were going to say good and bad bookstores.
all good bookstores and Amazon.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna say the one line that we can just end the recording, Max. Thank you very much. We just just whatever. Thank you very much, Andy. It's a pleasure having you with us again. We'll add all the details into the show notes. And to everyone else, thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Appreciate it.